Hey everyone, Darwin's God here. The genetic code demolishes the theory of evolution, and I'm going to explain why. First of all, it's very complicated. To get the genetic code going, you have to copy the DNA, edit that copy, and then translate that copy, and then you have a cleanup step. All four of those steps involve a lot of molecular machinery. There's just no way that even one of those machines is going to evolve by chance with natural selection. So it's very complicated. In fact, just a single protein, just evolving a single protein is extremely difficult. Okay, number two, it's circular. What is the genetic code used for? It's used for making proteins. Well, these molecular machines involve a lot of proteins, dozens and dozens, hundreds of proteins. So you need proteins, what? To make proteins. You have a chicken and the egg problem. Evolution is not going to be able to evolve this. Now, as icing on the cake, there are these special proteins I talked about last time that attach the amino acids to the tRNA molecules. There are 20 different amino acids, and there are 64 different triplets of nucleotides at the other end of the tRNAs. So a lot of different combinations. You have a great many proteins of these special proteins that have to attach the amino acids to the tRNA molecules after they donate their amino acid to make the new protein. So these special proteins have to be created by this process of using the genetic code. You can't just create one or two of them and then get going. You have to have this whole set in place, up and running. This is a huge problem for evolution. So you've got the complexity problem, and then you've got the circularity problem. Next, there's this problem that I talked about, which is it must have all happened in the early phases of evolution. That is, the genetic code must have evolved early in the evolutionary history. Why? Because it's universal. The genetic code is conserved across all species, so it must have been present, according to evolutionary theory, in the universal common ancestor. It must have evolved very early in the evolutionary process, leaving very little time for it to have evolved. That is another problem. There's just no time for this to happen. It would be a problem even if you had billions of years, but you don't. Next, there's the problem that the code is actually, according to evolutionary theory, unevolvable. Why? Because after the universal common ancestor, it could not have evolved because we have it across all of the species. It's universal. So from the universal common ancestor billions of years ago up until today, it could not have evolved according to evolutionary theory, which is amazing in and of itself considering all of the things that evolved during that must have evolved during that period. So you have all this tremendous evolutionary change happening, and the code can't evolve. So the code on the one hand had to evolve early on in evolutionary history, an amazing feat, and then it couldn't have evolved. It must have evolved, but yet cannot evolve. It must be evolvable. It cannot be evolvable. Next, the code can't be special. It must be mundane. It must be a trivial, simple code. Why? Because it evolved early on. There wasn't any time for it. There was no need for it to support mammals or birds or reptiles because they weren't around. All you had was this primitive, crude, single-celled entities. So the code must have been a simple accident, as Francis Crick famously called it, a frozen accident. Well, that's all wrong. We found out that it's a very special code. It's a 1 in a million code. It has all kinds of special properties. So the code must be mundane, but it's not mundane. Now, given all these problems, it's difficult to deny that this is a big problem for evolutionary theory. Evolutionist Eugene Koonin calculated the probability of evolving something like the genetic code and came up with a number of 10 to the minus 1,000. In other words, the probability of evolving something like this is 10 to the minus 1,000. That number may not make sense to you. Basically, it's impossible. It is astronomically small. You can forget about it. Koonin used that as an argument to say there must be an infinity of universes. In other words, yeah, this is impossible in our universe, so there must be an infinity or near infinity of universes. This is where evolutionary theory has taken us. It's making a joke out of science. Finally, a new paper that came out recently, I mentioned on a previous video, it's a review paper about the problem of protein evolution. And the paper talks about how the genetic code, the special properties of the genetic code could be a solution to this huge problem of how can you evolve a protein. So in other words, these error correction capabilities that we talked about in an earlier video, these error correction capabilities maybe could come to the rescue. Maybe they conveniently actually help to evolve new proteins. So what we see as an error correction feature could actually be a secret mechanism that evolution can use to create new proteins. Okay, now there are a lot of problems with this idea, and I'm not going to go over those now. It gets kind of detailed, but there's a huge problem for the theory of evolution with this idea. That problem is that it violates Occam's razor. It violates the principle of parsimony. That is, it calls on too much serendipity. Now think about it. What are we talking about here? Evolution creates the genetic code somehow. There's a huge problem with that, as we just talked about. And then the genetic code becomes the secret sauce for what? Evolution. So evolution creates something that then enables and creates evolution. You see the problem here? Too much serendipity. This shows up a lot in evolutionary theory, and it makes no sense. So what have we got here? The genetic code is very complex. The genetic code is circular. The genetic code must have evolved very early in the evolutionary process, and yet the genetic code must not be evolvable. The genetic code must not be special. It must be mundane, and yet the genetic code is very special. It's 1 in a million, and now the genetic code violates the basic fundamental rule of science, Occam's razor.